Tomorrow morning, I'll ask Mrs. Powers to make up the guest's bedroom and to put those extra heavy drapes up so they can sleep in. The Colvilles might have changed in the years since the Makepeaces had seen them, but their sleeping habits were surely going to be the same. Thanks, darling, Toddy said. Oh, please tell Mrs. Powers not to disturb anything on our office table. That's where I'm working this week. The next time Mark went into the office to take care of his email, he found the round table in the center of the room covered with lists. Toddy had moved her laptop from her desk to the table, and she was staring at the screen with an air of preoccupation. She was searching for something on Google, and when she found it, she read intently. The noisy voice of justice. No, not quite, she muttered, and Mark smiled. Toddy talked aloud when she was hot on the trail of a project. She was so engrossed in her research that she didn't even notice when Mark left the room after making a few phone calls and sending some emails. Maybe a fire in Tokyo. When Purcell and Dina drove in that night, they were treated to the best bottle of wine Mark's cellar could produce. And Toddy continued to be generous with the drinks all evening. Purcell and Dina were even more upscale than Mark and Toddy. In fact, sometimes Mark thought the two verged on pretentious, though he'd never tell Toddy that. Purcell was tall, slim, and gray-haired. He generally wore striped dress shirts, starched and rolled up to his elbows. He thought this made him look egalitarian. Sometimes he even tied his sweater sleeves around his neck as if he were posing for a J. Crew ad. Dina carried a purse that cost $800. Mark and Toddy knew this because Dina told them. Despite the Colvilles' affectations, they were good company, all in all. Mark found himself enjoying their visit more than he'd anticipated. While their guests took a stroll down the town's well-lit streets, Toddy popped An Inconvenient Truth into the DVD player. Mark could tell she was humming with anticipation. When Purcell and Dina returned to the house, relaxed and smiling, the moment was right. Toddy has something for you to watch, Mark said. We think it'll interest you. After the Colvilles had watched the film, Dina said, I had no idea, Purcell. I think we're horribly out of touch. Purcell nodded, looking rather self-consciously grave and thoughtful. What do you want us to do? He asked Toddy. She began to explain. By the time she'd finished, the Colvilles were on board with Toddy's plan of providing a grand gesture to mark the end of the Makepeaces' years in the United States. Preparations began in earnest the next day. Toddy had assigned Mark the job of looking for a house in Sweden. This was the kind of challenge Mark relished. So soon he was knee-deep in small boxes from Rosetta Stone and packets of papers from real estate agents. He and Toddy had agreed that they'd wait to put their house on the market after they were out of it, which saved them a lot of grief. Mark reflected for the millionth time that having money smoothed out many jagged corners as he examined a picture of a house for sale outside Malmö. Swedish homes tended to be wooden and barn-like, at least the ones he'd been viewing online. Mark thought Toddy would find them amusing. He was searching for a large home in the middle of a forest, which wasn't going to be easy to find. Purcell was acting as social advisor. He was helping Toddy assemble the guest list, and he was experimenting with the wording of the note of invitation. Dina was working on assembling the paperwork Toddy and Mark would need in their new life. This involved a lot of trips into the city to consult with people who kept a very, very low profile. She was also arranging for the staff they'd need. One night, Mark went into the study to track down a crossword puzzle book, and Toddy called him over. Darling, look at this man. she said, holding up a picture of a very heavy 40-year-old with big jowls and lots of blonde hair. Doesn't he look like he needs enlightening? Of course, Mark said promptly, and I'm sure he'd be honored to be the guest on the guest list for your party. Isn't that James Jeffrey Jameson, who imports rare woods for luxury homes? Yes, he's responsible for the clear cutting of thousands of acres of rainforest, Toddy said grimly. But then she caught sight of Mark's worried face, and she smiled up at him, her blue eyes sparkling. We're going to have a great party. We're going to show the film, and then we'll ask for contributions. I know they'll be glad to write great big checks, even Jameson. We'll persuade them. Dina was sitting on the other side of the table beside Purcell. She said, let's invite Catriona McHughes. She held up a magazine. See, she's the editor. She's always printing articles about global warming for her readers, but she just flew from New York to Chicago in her private jet for a party. What a criminal waste of fuel. Purcell seemed to be enjoying his normally uninvolved wife on fire about a cause. Even a near narcissist like Purcell could be swayed by the passion of a beautiful woman. This was not the Colvilles' usual style, so the novelty of it intrigued both of them. They'd probably dropped their new cause fairly quickly, but Mark realized their help was essential in assuring the Make-Peace farewell party's success. He would hate it if Toddy were disappointed the least little bit. Are we having the party here? Mark asked his wife the next time he passed through. Oh no, she said. We're making arrangements in the city. I don't think some of these people would come if they had to drive to Gracefield. They don't know us after all, though I'm sure they can find out we're rich. I'm counting on that. Anyway, we couldn't possibly handle all those cars. Dina, we need a competent driver for valet parking. Mark was beginning to appreciate the scope of Toddy's planning. He didn't want to sound mistrustful, but he had to ask one final question. You're asking them to bring the invitations with them? He said. Oh yes, Toddy said. It's the best means of preventing gatecrashers. Have you hired the caterer? Purcell asked. They'll expect good food. I'm on it, Dina said. Sweetheart, did you know Toddy and Mark are friends with Anna Clausen? Purcell looked suitably impressed, though neither he nor Dina was a foodie. Anna Clausen was the hottest caterer in the Boston area. Is Anna Clausen an environmentalist like you two? Purcell asked, conscious that Mrs. Powers was still in the kitchen. Toddy nodded. Yes, she is. She sure is. In fact, she's donating her time to the cause. When the guest list had been gone over with a fine-tooth comb, Toddy and Purcell tossed it on the table in front of Dina and Mark with an air of triumph. The list was short, only 26 names. Why so few? Mark asked. No waste, Purcell said. This is the maximum number we can persuade, I think. How'd you pick them? Mark could think of many major offenders that weren't listed. They're not the most important figures, as you see, but they're all on the blacklist, just the B or C blacklist, rather than the A. We had to pick people who would come without hangers-on or media. We want this to be a private affair. Mark recognized most of the names, though Dina was looking rather blank. Oh yes, the car manufacturer who wouldn't look for alternative fuel, he told Dina. Here's an EPA inspector who's under indictment for taking bribes. Good choice. Bella Bourdillon? Her beauty products are tested on bunnies, Toddy said. Her face was stiff with indignation. Is that strictly a global warming issue? Mark asked, trying not to smile. After all, you've eaten rabbit before. Bunnies, Toddy said, and I didn't torture them first. By the time the big evening rolled around, a lot of things had changed in the beautiful Victorian home in Bracefield. Many of the Makepeace's possessions had been sold or stored. Mrs. Powers had been bid farewell with a lovely large check, and Dina and Purcell had thrown their bags in the trunk of their car, since they'd be returning to their own place in Westchester immediately after the festivities. Mark had been at his town office 10 hours a day for the past week, ensuring that when they arrived in Sweden, they'd have a place to stay while they viewed homes and a secure financial base. Toddy and Mark were dressed to the nines. Toddy looked delicious and elegant in silver-spangled vintage, Dior, Mark in a very conventional but tailor-made tux. They stood in the living room of the home they'd shared for 2 happy decades. Toddy had trouble holding back tears. Come on, darling. The future promises buckets of fun. Mark and Toddy were so seldom melancholy that he wasn't used to having to raise her spirits.